She abandoned this family years ago, my stepfather said to the mediator, his voice measured, rehearsed. My mother nodded beside him, hands folded over a manila envelope. Her name on the policy is a clerical oversight, nothing more. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at either of them. I kept my eyes on the wall just above the mediator's head and waited. Then the mediator set down her pen, looked directly at my stepfather's lawyer, and asked one question. Counsel, are you certain you've reviewed all documentation pertaining to your client's estate? The lawyer's hand stopped mid-sentence on his notepad. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I had learned early that silence unsettles people who expect a reaction, especially people who have spent years controlling the story. The mediation room at the Toronto Family Law Office was nothing like what most people picture when they think about legal disputes. No courtroom drama, no elevated bench, no gallery of witnesses, just a rectangular table with water glasses no one touched, a window overlooking a parking garage on King Street, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. My stepfather sat across from me in a charcoal wool blazer he wore whenever he wanted to appear reasonable. He had that quality some men cultivate over decades, the ability to seem calm while dismantling something carefully. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. My mother sat beside him, slightly angled toward his shoulder the way she always positioned herself in rooms where decisions were being made. She was the kind of woman who presented cooperation as a personality trait while quietly ensuring outcomes aligned with her preferences. Her lawyer had arranged 3 neat stacks of documents in front of him. My lawyer, Claire, sat beside me with a single legal pad and a blue pen she hadn't uncapped yet. She didn't need to. We had already agreed on how this would begin. The estate in question belonged to my grandmother, my father's mother, a woman named Margaret who had lived her entire adult life in a 3-bedroom house in Oakville, Ontario, raised 2 children largely on her own after my grandfather's death, and spent the last decade of her life making sure every piece of paper in her possession said exactly what she meant it to say. My mother had been married to my father for 11 years before the divorce. My grandmother had loved my father. She had been more cautious about my mother. When my father died suddenly 4 years ago, the grief was real and it was complicated and it reorganized everything that followed. My stepfather entered the picture 18 months after that. I was 26. I was finishing my residency at St. Michael's Hospital and I had exactly the kind of schedule that makes consistent family presence impossible. 48-hour shifts, on-call weekends, dinners that became voicemails, visits that became rescheduled twice before being quietly canceled. I was not absent because I had stopped caring. I was absent because caring in the specific shape my family expected required time I was legally and ethically obligated to spend somewhere else. That distinction never made it into their version of events. My name had been on my grandmother's life insurance policy since I was 19. She had added me herself, in the same quiet, deliberate way she did most things, without announcement, without ceremony. She believed records spoke louder than intentions. I only found out because her financial advisor contacted me 8 months after her passing, forwarding documents that had been sent to an address I hadn't lived at in 3 years. By the time they reached me, a secondary beneficiary amendment had already been filed. My name appeared on the original policy. It did not appear on the amended version. There was a date on the amendment. I checked it against my own records. My grandmother had been in palliative care at Credit Valley Hospital for 6 weeks by then. She had not been discharged. She had not visited a financial advisor. She had not driven anywhere. The first person I called was not a lawyer. It was the ward nurse who had overseen my grandmother's care. I asked one question. Was Margaret Callahan ever alone with non-medical visitors during her final weeks? There was a pause. Then yes, she said. Her daughter-in-law came several times, always with paperwork. I called Claire 2 days later. Our first meeting was at her office on Bay Street, a Wednesday afternoon in November with sleet coming sideways off the lake. She had a reputation for being methodical rather than dramatic, which was exactly what I needed. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the timeline. When I finished, she asked me the same question my attorney in any version of this story would ask. What do you want out of this? I thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. I want the record corrected, I said. She raised an eyebrow. That's it? That's everything, I replied. She nodded slowly. Then she said, Good, because this isn't about emotion. It's about documentation. And if your grandmother was who you say she was, the documentation will hold. My grandmother was exactly who I said she was. I grew up spending every second weekend in Oakville. My grandmother's house smelled like tea and cedar and whatever she was baking, which was usually something she claimed was simple and turned out to require 4 separate steps and 2 rest periods. She was not a sentimental woman in the traditional sense. She didn't keep every drawing I made or photograph every birthday, but she kept records. She kept receipts. She kept letters and bank statements in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom that she organized by year and labeled in her precise, slightly old-fashioned handwriting. She believed, and told me more than once, that the way you protect someone is to write things down. That memory fades and people misremember, and intentions mean nothing once the person holding them is gone. What stays is paper. I had grown up watching her apply this philosophy to everything from household finances to her garden maintenance schedule. It had shaped the way I approached medicine. When I became a physician, my documentation was thorough to the point that senior colleagues occasionally teased me about it. I didn't find it funny. I found it essential. The weeks between our first meeting and the mediation session were not passive. Claire requested the original policy from the insurance provider. She requested the amendment filing and the supporting documentation. She obtained a copy of my grandmother's hospital admission and discharge record showing she had been in continuous inpatient palliative care for the entirety of the period during which the amendment was allegedly authorized. She requested the notarization details. The notary listed on the amendment had a practice in Mississauga. Claire contacted them. The appointment in question had been attended by my stepfather and a woman described as the policyholder's representative with power of attorney. There was a power of attorney document on file. It had been executed 4 months before my grandmother's admission, during a window when her health had been declining but her capacity had not yet been formally assessed. That mattered. Significantly, Claire also filed a request with the hospital's administrative office for any documentation of my grandmother's expressed wishes or communications during her final admission. That request took 3 weeks to process. What came back was not dramatic. It was a single sheet, a form completed by the palliative care social worker during an intake assessment, standard practice at Credit Valley, designed to capture patient preferences and concerns. Under a section asking whether the patient had any unresolved matters they wished to address, my grandmother had written in her own hand, in ink, slightly unsteady but legible, "I want my granddaughter Claire to have what I set aside for her. She knows what it means. My name is not Claire. My grandmother called me by my middle name, my entire life. My legal first name is Margaret, the same as hers. She had called me Claire since I was 4 years old because, she said, I had my great-aunt Claire's eyes and the same habit of watching a room before deciding to speak. Everyone in the family knew this. It was not ambiguous. I read the form 3 times in Claire's office. I didn't feel relief the way I expected. I felt the specific quiet that comes when something you suspected reveals itself as true. My grandmother had known. She had understood, somewhere in those final weeks, that something was being moved around her. And in the only way available to her, with a social worker's intake form and a slightly unsteady hand, she had tried to correct it. I did not cry in Claire's office. I waited until I was in my car in the parking garage, and then I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes. Then I drove back to the hospital for a night shift, and I did my job. The mediation session was set for a Tuesday in February. Outside it was -14 and the kind of dry that cracked your lips between the parking lot and the front door. My stepfather arrived with his lawyer and my mother arrived beside him. She didn't look at me when she came in. She looked at the table, at her folder, at the water glass she didn't touch. I had seen that expression before. It was the expression she wore when she had already decided how something would go and was waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Darg, Osei, who had the particular stillness of someone who had sat in rooms like this for 2 decades and stopped being surprised by any of it, welcomed everyone and outlined the process. She was there to facilitate, not decide. What we reached or didn't reach today would be documented. Anything unresolved could proceed to court. She asked if both parties understood. We did. My stepfather's lawyer spoke first. He outlined the position clearly and without excess. My grandmother had updated her estate documents to reflect the family structure as it existed at the time of her passing. My absence from the family had been consistent and long-standing. The amendment had been executed lawfully with proper authorization. My name's absence from the current policy was not an error. It was a decision. That word. Decision. That word. Decision. I noted it. My mother added quietly that she didn't think I had intended to be difficult, that she understood how busy my career had kept me, that she had always hoped things would be different between us. She said this in a tone that implied generosity, as if acknowledging my humanity were a gift she was choosing to extend. I remained still. My breathing stayed even. I had learned to do that in a hospital, where stillness under pressure is not a personality trait but a professional requirement. Then my stepfather said it. The line he had prepared. The line he believed would close the question. She abandoned this family years ago. Her name on that policy is a clerical oversight, a relic. It doesn't represent Margaret's actual wishes. My mother's lawyer nodded. These updates are simply a reflection of reality, he said. Dr. Osei wrote something on her notepad. Then she set her pen down and looked at my stepfather's lawyer directly. Counsel, she said, are you certain you've reviewed all documentation pertaining to your client's estate? It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even particularly pointed. It was precise. The lawyer hesitated for less than a second, but hesitation in a room like that doesn't need to be long to be noticed. I believe so, he said. Dr. Osei looked at him for one additional beat. Very well, she said. I'd like to ensure we're all working from the same evidentiary foundation before we proceed. She turned to Claire. Please submit your documentation for review. Claire uncapped her blue pen for the first time and opened her folder. During the recess that followed, I stood at the window looking out at the parking garage. My stepfather spoke in low, rapid tones to his lawyer at the far end of the hallway. My mother stood slightly apart, arms crossed, looking at the floor. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just measuring her differently now. Claire appeared beside me. You okay? She asked. I nodded. They didn't know about the hospital form, she said quietly. No, I said. They wouldn't have. She gave a brief nod. Then they're going to try to challenge her capacity. I know, I said. They can try. She looked at me for a moment. You prepared for this to get harder before it gets resolved. I've had harder weeks, I said. She smiled faintly. I know. I've read your schedule. The capacity argument came in the following session, 3 weeks later. My stepfather's lawyer argued that my grandmother's documented statements during her palliative admission could not be taken as legally authoritative expressions of intent, given her medical condition at the time. He was careful. He didn't say she was confused. He said she was vulnerable. He said the environment of palliative care created conditions where patient communications required careful interpretation. I had anticipated this, so had Claire. We had obtained a declaration from the palliative care physician who had overseen my grandmother's final weeks. It was 2 pages. It stated clearly that my grandmother had been assessed for cognitive capacity multiple times during her admission as a matter of standard protocol. It stated that she had demonstrated consistent orientation, coherent communication, and retained decision-making capacity until the final 72 hours of her life. It stated the date of the intake form. It fell well within the window of documented capacity. It also noted, briefly, that my grandmother had asked the care team on 2 separate occasions whether her granddaughter, the doctor, had been contacted. The care team had provided the contact information my mother had supplied during the admission intake. That contact information was my mother's cell phone number. No one had called me. When Claire submitted that addendum, my stepfather's lawyer stopped writing mid-sentence. My mother's hand pressed flat against the table. My stepfather looked, for the first time in either session, genuinely uncertain rather than strategically restrained. Dr. Osei reviewed the declaration without expression. She asked my stepfather's lawyer if he wished to respond. He said he would need time to consult with his client. She granted 30 minutes. I spent those 30 minutes in the building's small cafe on the ground floor, drinking a coffee I didn't particularly want, and reviewing a patient file I had brought on the unlikely chance I would find a quiet moment. The cafe played soft radio. Someone near the window was having a conversation about hockey. The city continued outside in the ordinary way cities do, entirely indifferent to what was being resolved upstairs. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was my mother. I answered. There was a pause before she spoke. The kind that isn't about finding words, but about deciding which ones to use. I didn't think it would go this far, she said finally. I didn't respond. She continued. I handled things after your father died. Someone had to. There was a lot to manage and you weren't available. I know, I said, I understand that. Then, but managing things doesn't include replacing them. Another pause, longer. He convinced me it was the right thing to do, she said. Her voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but less arranged. The presentation had dropped slightly. I don't know what to say to you, she added. I let the silence sit. I'm not asking you to say anything, I said eventually. I'm asking for the record to be correct. She exhaled. Margaret would have wanted that, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. She did. She wrote it down. The line stayed open for a few seconds after that without either of us speaking. Then she said she had to go back upstairs. I said I would be there shortly. We hung up and I sat with the coffee for another moment, watching the street. When we reconvened, the atmosphere had changed the way pressure changes before weather shifts. Not dramatic, measurable. My stepfather's lawyer submitted a revised position. He did not concede error. Lawyers rarely do in those rooms, but he proposed a settlement that acknowledged my standing as an intended beneficiary and outlined a restructured distribution consistent with the original policy. The language was careful. It was also a retreat. Dr. Osei looked at both parties. She asked if there were any objections to proceeding on the basis of the proposed framework. There were none. The documentation took 6 weeks. Signatures, verifications, adjustments made in offices that process these things with quiet efficiency and no interest in the emotional history attached to them. My grandmother's original intent was restored in the official record. My name appeared where she had placed it. I accepted what was mine. I did not pursue additional claims. I did not request findings of misconduct to be entered against my stepfather, though Claire had advised me I had grounds to request an investigation into the power of attorney execution. I chose not to, not because he didn't deserve scrutiny, because the record was now correct, and that was what I had come for. My stepfather did not contact me after the settlement. That was fine. Some relationships don't recover, and pretending otherwise costs more than it returns. My mother called me in April, about a month after everything was finalized. We talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than we had talked in years. She asked about my work. I asked about her garden, which she had always maintained with the same quiet dedication she applied to most things. We didn't talk about what had happened in any direct way. We talked around it, the way you talk around a piece of furniture that's been moved. You know the room is different. You navigate accordingly. Before she hung up, she said, I should have called you when she was asking for you. I know, I said. She said, I don't have a good reason. I said, I know that too. There was a pause. She said she was sorry. I believed her. I also knew that sorry and repaired were different things and that we were somewhere in between, which was closer than we had been. I used a portion of the settlement to establish a small bursary through the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine. It's awarded annually to a student in the physician assistant program who demonstrates financial need and academic commitment. My grandmother had believed that people who worked in care deserved to be supported. The bursary carries her name, Margaret Eleanor Callahan. Not a foundation, not a wing, just a name on a record that will be read once a year by someone who needed the help and got it. I directed another portion to a family mediation access fund through a community legal clinic in Scarborough that provides pro bono mediation services to families who can't afford private dispute resolution. The kind of access that should exist and too often doesn't. Neither of those things made the news. Neither of them required announcement. They are simply in the record now, the way my grandmother would have wanted things to be. On a Saturday in May, I drove out to Oakville. I parked on the street in front of her house, which now belonged to someone else. A young couple who had already painted the front door a shade of green my grandmother would have found aggressively modern. I sat there for a few minutes. I wasn't waiting for anything. I just wanted to be in the geography of her life one more time before I stopped needing to. I thought about the intake form, her slightly unsteady writing, the specificity of it. She had not written, "I want my granddaughter to be taken care of," which would have been warm but vague. She had written, "I want my granddaughter Claire to have what I set aside for her." Precise. Intentional. The way she did everything that mattered. She had known that memory fades, and people misremember, and the only thing that survives intact, if you're careful, is what you write down. She had taught me that. I had spent years applying it in operating rooms and on night shifts, and in every chart I completed with the kind of thoroughness that occasionally made colleagues roll their eyes. She had taught me that accuracy is not pedantry, it's protection. I drove back to the city on the QEW with the lake flat and gray to my right and the skyline coming up slow ahead of me. I had a shift at 7. I had 3 files to review before then. I had a message from a colleague about a case that needed a second opinion. I was busy in the particular way that means you have built something you are genuinely responsible for, which is different from the busyness of avoidance, and different again from the busyness of distraction. I was, in the specific and unshowy sense of the word, fine. The thing people misunderstand about these situations, and I say this having sat on the other side of them in small rooms with water glasses no one touches, is that the goal isn't the moment when the other side concedes. It isn't the settlement number or the lawyer's quiet "this went how I hoped." It's something quieter and less photographable than that. It's the moment you stop carrying someone else's version of you, when you stop trying to argue against an image that was never accurate and start simply existing in the accuracy of the actual record. They had put me down as absent, as estranged, as a name that didn't need to be there. They had done it carefully, politely, with paperwork and proper authorization and the quiet confidence of people who believe that control, managed neatly enough, is indistinguishable from truth. My grandmother knew otherwise. She had known it her whole life. She had filed documents and kept receipts and written things down because she understood that the people who love you aren't always the ones in the room when decisions get made. Sometimes love looks like a form completed in a hospital bed in Mississauga in November, in ink that goes slightly unsteady toward the right margin, saying clearly, "She knows what it means. I knew what it means. I knew what it meant." If you have ever been the person written out of a room you were always part of, you know that the answer isn't to get louder. It isn't to demand that people re-examine their version of events. The answer is the same one my grandmother gave me in every filing cabinet, every labeled folder, every receipt kept past the point of necessity. Write it down. Build the record. And then let the record speak, because it will, when it needs to, in rooms where it can no longer be ignored. If this story stayed with you, I'd be glad to hear what it brought up for you. And if you know someone navigating something quiet and complicated in their own family, the kind of thing that doesn't make it into conversation easily, maybe this is worth passing along. Thanks for being here. There is a particular kind of harm that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrives in the form of paperwork filed quietly, of contact information redirected, of a name removed from a document while the person it belongs to is working a 48-hour shift and trusting that the people who raised her are capable of basic decency. That is what happened to me. And for a long time, I didn't fully understand what it had cost me, not because I was unaware, but because I had been trained, by the same people who caused the harm, to treat my own absence from the record as a personal failing rather than a deliberate act. What changed wasn't the settlement. It wasn't even the mediator's question, or the hospital form in my grandmother's handwriting, or the moment my stepfather's composure finally shifted into something that looked more like accountability. What changed was the decision, made quietly in a lawyer's office on a Wednesday afternoon in November, to stop accepting someone else's version of the facts. That decision required something that doesn't get discussed enough. Not courage in the dramatic sense, but patience. The willingness to build carefully, to document thoroughly, to resist the pressure to react before the moment is right. My grandmother had that quality. She passed it to me without ever naming it. She just showed me what it looked like to treat accuracy as a form of care. The people who altered those documents believed that absence could be made permanent if the paperwork supported it. They understood, correctly, that most people will not pursue a correction if doing so costs them more than the correction is worth. What they didn't account for was that for some of us, the record itself is the thing that matters, not the money, not the acknowledgement. The simple, non-negotiable fact of being written down accurately in the place where you were always supposed to be. That is a lesson about consequences that has nothing to do with punishment. Every choice made in that process, the redirected phone number, the amended policy, the power of attorney executed while my grandmother's health was declining, each one produced a corresponding result. Not because the universe enforces fairness, but because documentation is cumulative. Every record my stepfather's lawyer filed contained his signature. Every notarized form had a date. Every date could be cross-referenced against a hospital admission log. The effort to remove me from the record created, in the process of being executed, the very paper trail that undid it. That is not irony. That is just how careful dishonesty works when it encounters careful honesty. I think about my grandmother often now. The intake form, her slightly unsteady handwriting pressing into the page. She could not call me. She could not stop what was happening in the offices and law firms beyond the walls of that palliative ward. But she could pick up a pen and write one clear sentence in a space that asked about unresolved matters. She knew that if someone was paying attention, that sentence would be enough. She was right. The most enduring thing any of us can do for the people we love is leave behind something true, something that holds.